Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we find ourselves at the edge of a mortal feast, one filled with honeyed wine, gossip, and more roasted goat than is medically advisable. But there's something off about the guest list. There's a goose in the garden. It honks like it knows too much. Tonight we explore the story of a god who had every form available to him: eagle, bull, shower of gold, and still chose to crash a party as a goose. Not for glory, not for love, just to watch, just to listen, just to be unsettlingly feathered at the appetizer table. Welcome to Olympus Surveillance, where the wings are divine and the motives are messy. So, before you settle in, feel free to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. You can also leave a comment. Let me know where you are listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, for that gentle hum in the background, and together, let's ease into tonight's story. You were planning a feast. Not a huge one, just enough to suggest you're moderately important, possibly divine adjacent, and absolutely worth immortal interruption. The invitations were wax sealed with care, the olives were aggressively pickled, and someone's uncle had already begun tuning a lyre without being asked. But you didn't count on this. A guest you didn't invite. No sandals, no cloak, no conversational boundaries. Just a goose. White, observant, oddly judgmental. And you don't dare shoo it, because in ancient Greece, a goose might just be Zeus, or a punishment, or both. That's the trouble with living too close to Mount Olympus. Nothing stays private. Your parties, your prayers, your arguments about who brought the bad wine, they're all subject to divine drop-ins. Sometimes in disguise. Sometimes not even trying that hard. Sometimes onking. This is a story not of thunderbolts, but of party fouls. Not of epic battles, but of awkward small talk with an avian deity who probably shouldn't be near the dessert tray. Tonight, we'll follow the trail of breadcrumbs, literal and mythic, through the banquet halls of mortals and the shape-shifting egos of gods. You'll meet hosts who regret their hospitality, guests who forget their mortal manners, scribes who try to write it all down without getting zapped, and, of course, one goose who may or may not be omnipotent. So get comfortable. You won't need a toga, just a bit of patience and a warm beverage, because the god of sky and thunder is about to make things weird, and he will expect applause. You've spent all week preparing, not that you had a choice. In this world, hosting isn't about generosity, it's about survival, reputation, and not being turned into a lizard by accident. The feast was supposed to be modest. Maybe 2 kinds of olives, a few half-mashed figs pretending to be dessert, bread that only cracked some teeth. You told yourself it would be enough. You even borrowed a friend's amphora, the nice one, with the painting of Dionysus drinking responsibly. The guests begin arriving. There's a merchant who's already sweating through his tunic, a poet who keeps quoting himself, and a minor priest who insists on blessing every grape. It's loud, it's sticky, it smells like ambition and goat cheese, but you're managing. Then you hear it. Not a knock, not a voice, just a honk. You don't remember inviting any poultry. You open the door and there it is. A goose, large, white, radiating the kind of quiet authority usually reserved for old men who win arguments by clearing their throat. It waddles in without waiting. Its eyes scan the room like it's calculating the square footage of your soul. You freeze, because in stories and in this world, everything is a story. Geese don't just appear. They arrive. They are sent. And sometimes they are gods wearing feathers because human forms are apparently too subtle. It finds a seat. Not a seat, your seat. The one you reserved for the elder who taught you how to properly sacrifice lentils. The goose settles into the cushion with all the weight of divine disapproval. You offer it a fig. It does not blink. Now, here's the part where reality starts to unravel like an old tunic. You try to continue the feast. You try. But no one will eat while the goose is watching. No one will speak unless spoken to by the goose. Someone swears it nodded when they complimented the olive paste. Someone else claims the goose sighed when the bard started reciting. The bard has not recovered. You think about removing it, maybe calling the local temple, maybe throwing a cloak over it and pretending it's a very judgmental centerpiece. But then it honks again once, sharply, and the wine jug cracks. No one saw it move, but everyone suddenly feels very, very mortal. At this point you start to reconsider the whole concept of hospitality. You thought it meant feeding the hungry. Now it seems to mean surviving the scrutiny of supernatural poultry. You thought your biggest problem would be the undercooked lentils. Now you're wondering if your soul can be judged through a goose's beak. This isn't the first time it's happened, either. Legends are full of these encounters. Zeus as a swan, a bull, a golden rain, and now a goose with opinions. Gods love parties. They just hate RSVPing. And if they show up, you can't send them away. You can't pretend you're not home. You can't explain that your house only has 2 couches and one has fleas. So you carry on. You refill goblets no one drinks from. You pretend not to hear the goose muttering in ancient dialects. You nod solemnly as it honks at the lyre player, who immediately stops mid-pluck and begins sweating profusely. Eventually the night ends. The goose leaves, just walks out. No flourish, no flash of lightning, no tip for the servers. Just one last long stare. A stare that lingers in your spine. The silence it leaves behind is heavier than most conversations. You clean up in silence. Olive pits on the floor, 1 fig uneaten, a cracked jug, and the faint smell of divine irritation. You hosted a feast. You didn't serve glory. You didn't entertain heroism. You survived. And in this part of the world, that's the highest compliment a god might pay. So you try again. A different night. A different feast. This time, you plan carefully, very carefully. You avoid anything too ambitious. No flaming dishes, no poetic recitations, and absolutely no food shaped like animals. You even double-check the figs to make sure none of them look too suggestive. You set the table like it's a prayer. The bread is fresh, or at least recently scraped. The wine has been watered just enough to not inspire honesty. The olives are neatly arranged in concentric circles, because maybe geometry pleases the gods. You are ready. The guests arrive. They're simpler this time. A humble farmer, a silent weaver, one elderly man who might be a philosopher or might just be lost. You feel safer. No one is too loud. No one has brought an instrument. And then you smell feathers. Not the pleasant, airy sort you imagine on swans drifting across a lake. No, this is the smell of damp straw and arrogant molting. A smell that says, I have arrived. And your peace is over. You don't look. Not right away. Maybe if you don't acknowledge it, it will go away. Maybe it's just a chicken. It is not a chicken. It is the goose. Again, it doesn't honk this time. It simply sits in the corner, on a cushion meant for knees in prayer, and watches. Its eyes gleam like polished coins in a market stall that only accepts your soul as payment. The fig plate trembles in your hands. You offer it forward, carefully, respectfully. You've even chosen the best fig, the plumpest one, with just a hint of gold at the stem and no blemish except a slightly unfortunate crease that might resemble a smile. The goose stares. You place the fig in front of it and step back like it's a lit firework. Nothing. Then, slowly, it lowers its head and pecks the fig in half. Juice sprays. A pit rolls across the floor. The room freezes. The goose looks up and honks. It is not a friendly honk. It is not a musical honk. It is the kind of honk that carries judgment, the sound of divine bureaucracy displeased with your offering. The room reacts as though lightning has struck the soup. The weaver faints. The philosopher immediately claims he's never met you. The farmer, brave soul that he is, tries to distract the goose. Distract the goose with a bit of cheese. It doesn't work. The cheese is ignored. The farmer is now under investigation. You try to remain calm. After all, what could possibly be wrong with the fig? Was it too ripe? Not ripe enough? Was there a worm? Was the worm symbolic? Was the fig itself symbolic? Is your entire life now symbolic? These are not questions you can ask. You offer another fig, smaller, less threatening. The goose ignores it entirely. You are now in a standoff with an immortal poultry deity over a plate of aggressively inoffensive fruit. Someone coughs. The goose honks again. It's unclear whether this is punishment or ritual. You consider apologizing, but to whom? The fos, the fig, the concept of hospitality itself. You settle for bowing deeply, until your spine reminds you that reverence has orthopedic consequences. The goose stands. Everyone holds their breath. It turns, waddles slowly toward the door, pauses, honks one last time, softer now, almost as if saying, "Try harder." Then it leaves. No lightning, no transformation, no applause. Just a half-eaten fig and the lingering knowledge that you have disappointed something that may or may not control the tides. The guests don't say anything. They just drift out one by one, as if escaping a haunted amphitheater. You remain, with the fig pit, and the silence, and the growing suspicion that next time the goose will bring a friend. You pour the wine slowly, partly to show reverence, partly because the last time you rushed, you spilled some, and the goose stared at the stain like it was planning to resurrect your ancestors just to scold them. Tonight is different. You've acquired a new amphora. It's slightly chipped, definitely stolen, and supposedly blessed by Dionysus himself, though the priest who sold it to you also swore it doubled as a fertility charm. You try not to think too hard about that part. The amphora's wide, decorated, and unnervingly smug-looking. There's a painted face on it, probably a satyr, but the longer you stare, the more it seems to blink. You tell yourself it's just the flickering torchlight. You are wrong. You finish pouring and set the amphora down. It wobbles. Slightly. Just enough to remind you that ancient pottery has opinions. The guests arrive. One brings olives stuffed with garlic and ambition. Another brings a lyre and no discernible talent. A third brings nothing, as tradition demands. You welcome them all. You smile. You do not mention the goose. You tell yourself, maybe tonight it won't show up. Then the air changes. It's not a sound, exactly. More like a collective hush of all things sacred and embarrassed. The kind of quiet that settles just before a god decides to make an entrance wearing the body of a minor inconvenience. You don't look. You pour more wine. The amphora tilts. By itself. You watch the surface of the wine ripple like it's reacting to judgment. You stare into your cup and see a reflection that does not match your face. It has feathers. You sip anyway. The goose is here. It does not sit this time. It hovers metaphorically near the edge of the gathering, like a tax auditor pretending to enjoy a picnic. Its presence distorts the evening. People speak in whispers, afraid their compliments will be misinterpreted as critiques. Someone drops a fig. No one picks it up. The fig stays there like a trap. Then the goose approaches the amphora. You hold your breath. It circles it. Once. Twice. 3 times. Like it's considering whether to invest in your hospitality portfolio or burn your house down with a onk. It pecks the amphora. Gently. Then again. Then stops. Everyone stares. You feel your intestines preparing to become metaphors. Nothing happens. Then it looks up at you and blinks, which should be impossible. Geese do not blink like that. Gods, however, do. The amphora groans. Or maybe that was you. Someone finally speaks, a young boy, probably new to mythic trauma, and says, "Is it blessing the wine?" You want to believe that. You need to believe that. Because the alternative is that your amphora is now an oracle. The goose is its patron. And you've just poured sacred visions into someone's leftover goblet. You try to redirect the conversation. So, anyone try the cheese? No one has. No one will. They are too busy pretending they didn't see the goose nod at the amphora, like it's approving of your decor. You're now hosting not a feast, but a test. A ritual. Possibly a prophecy unveiling disguised as a wine tasting. You pour more wine. The amphora hisses. The goose honks. A match made in confusion. At some point, Someone declares that the wine tastes like knowing too much. You pretend to laugh. You do not sip again. The goose leaves eventually, but the amphora stays behind. No one touches it. No one dares. The painted eyes keep watching. And somewhere, in the divine bureaucracy of Olympus, a feathered note is made. You are trying, but not well enough. This time, it's just bread. You've given up on the figs. You've hidden the amphora behind a curtain. You've told the lyre player not to speak, breathe, or exist too loudly. The guest list is sparse 3 cousins, a neighbour who owes you flour, and someone who swore they were an oracle once, but mostly just likes free food. You've baked the bread yourself, which seemed noble at the time, until your hands blistered, until the dough stuck to everything, except your expectations, until your kitchen smelled like a thunderstorm had argued with a beehive and lost. Still, it's done. The loaf is round, golden, slightly scorched on the bottom, and emits the soft crackle of false confidence. You set it on the table. The door creaks. No one knocks. Of course not. The goose is punctual, always uninvited, always precisely 5 minutes after you tell yourself, maybe not tonight. It waddles in. Straight past the cousins, who instinctively bow. Past the oracle, who tries to look invisible. Past the neighbour, who immediately drops their cup and mutters an apology to the concept of grain. The goose stops. It sees the bread and tilts its head. You feel the room freeze again, that now familiar atmosphere of mussia, the baked form. The bread, you realise, has cracked just slightly along the top. The fissure forms a crooked line. Maybe a symbol. Maybe a symbol. Maybe a warning. Maybe just your oven's revenge. But the goose sees something. It steps forward. Pecks. Crumbs scatter. You do not breathe. It pecks again. A chunk falls off. The guests lean back. No one speaks. Even the lyre player, whose lungs have never quite mastered silence, stays perfectly still. The goose circles the loaf. Once. Twice. Then it does the unthinkable. It walks away. No judgment. No honk. No miracle. Just indifference, which is worse, because now you don't know what the bread meant. You look at the broken crust, the missing chunk, the trail of crumbs. You wonder, was it not worthy? Was it too soft? Too humble? Did you use the wrong flour? Was the flour itself cursed? The oracle leans in and whispers. Sometimes indifference is a sign of future wrath. You wish they hadn't said that. You clean the crumbs. Slowly. Reverently. Like you're handling relics. Someone coughs. You flinch. The neighbour tries to help, but ends up stepping on a crust. You both stare at the crushed piece like it might start bleeding. Later, when the goose is gone and the night has thinned out like weak wine, your cousins suggest that maybe, just maybe, you overthought it. You smile. You nod. You do not agree, because you saw the way the goose looked at the bread, like it remembered something, like it almost forgave you, like it was disappointed it couldn't be disappointed. You lie awake that night, the taste of scorched grain in your mouth, the smell of molasses and mild regret in your sheets. You dream of loaves that open like scrolls, of crumbs arranging themselves into names, of feathers brushing against warm crust with judgment. When you wake up, the bread is gone, the crumbs too, and on the table, exactly where the loaf once sat, is a single white feather. You touch it. It turns into flour, and you know next time you'll kneel. It was supposed to be a practical decision. You have 5 chairs. One is broken. One is cursed. One is sticky in ways no one can explain, which leaves you with 2 decent seats, and one ottoman that used to be a goat crate. You arrange them carefully, best one for the village elder, second best for the person who brought cheese, the crate for whoever shows up last, and doesn't complain. You do not prepare a seat for a goose, because you're still pretending this won't happen again. The table is modest, but arranged with the solemn hope that symmetry counts as charm. A plate of boiled lentils sits exactly centre, as if to distract from the fact that you couldn't afford fish. The cups are mismatched, each borrowed from someone who thinks you're hosting a poetry reading. You are not. And then the shadow falls across the door. You pretend not to see it. You begin discussing something bland. The weather. The tax grain. That time ago to your cousin. And nobody intervened. But everyone else goes quiet. The air thickens not like a storm, but like a memory returning with feathers. You turn, you smile. You die a little. The goose enters and looks at the chairs and stops. It scans the room, and you can feel its judgment like someone's wringing your spine through a sieve. There is no seat prepared, and this, apparently, is an insult. You scramble. You offer the sticky chair. The goose does not move. You gesture to the ottoman. It blinks once slowly as if you've asked Apollo to share a bench with a cabbage. The broken chair creaks ominously in the corner. You consider fixing it with desperation and lies. You wave your hand over it and mumble something about sacred wood. The goose is unimpressed. So you stand. You take your own seat, the good one, the one that doesn't bite, and slowly slide it away from the table. You offer it. You bow. The goose waddles over, mounts the chair, and settles in. You breathe again, though it sounds more like a whimper. Everyone pretends this is normal. The village elder nods solemnly. The cheesebringer fakes a sudden devotion to silence. Someone whispers, "It has excellent posture," and gets elbowed. You try to proceed, to serve lentils, to begin polite conversation. But the room has shifted. The goose is not simply a guest, it is now the focal point, the center of gravity, the chairman of the board of your humility. And then it shifts. Just slightly. The chair groans. Everyone freezes. The curse is still in the room. Not the broken one, the sacred one. The unspoken rule that divine beings sit where they are meant to, not where desperate mortals shuffle things around and call it hospitality. You begin to sweat. You're fairly certain your back is now just a puddle in a tunic. The goose is still. Then it pecks once at the edge of the table, not violently, not softly, just enough to make the ceramic bowl rattle like a guilty child. You nod. You smile. You offer more lentils. It does not eat. It simply watches. You get through the rest of the meal on instinct and fear. Every chair squeak is a thunderclap. Every word feels like an audition for forgiveness. By the end, no one has eaten much. Everyone has developed an opinion about seating arrangements and mortal futility. When the goose leaves, it does not say goodbye. It simply steps down, walks to the door, pauses, looks back at the chair, and honks. Once. The meaning is unclear, possibly approval, possibly a warning. You never sit in that chair again. Tonight you try something new. Not better, just different. Which, in your life, usually means worse. The idea is simple: distraction. If the goose does arrive, and let's be honest, it always does, perhaps music will soften its divine honking. Maybe a melody will soothe it, lull it into complacency, or at least drown out the sound of your guests quietly. You hire a flute player, not a great one, but he has teeth and breath, and a face that says, "I once played for a noble who didn't throw anything at me." That's good enough. He arrives with a satchel full of dented pipes and a smile that does reach his eyes. You take this as a positive omen. The feast is small, mostly starches pretending to be vegetables. The bread is unburned, which feels like a moral victory, and the amphora has been turned around, so the painted eyes now face the wall. You're not ready to deal with those again. And then the onk, not loud, not angry, just present. The goose enters, as always, unannounced and unmistakably self-important. This time it glances at the food, the guests, the candles, the curtains, and then at the flute player. You nod at him. He nods back. The performance begins. The first note is shrill, not bird-like, more like a startled kettle trying to apologize. The goose blinks. The second note is worse. The flute squeaks. A guest coughs. The cheese sweats. The air develops tension, like a thundercloud that's taken offense. The goose stares at the musician. He continues bravely a melody that might once have been pastoral, now barely clinging to life. You recognize the tune vaguely, something about shepherds and stars and a festival that went badly. Then the goose honks, loudly. Once, the flute player falters. The note dies in his mouth. He coughs, then tries again. Like a man trying to serenade a bear out of a cave. Another honk. Louder. The candle nearest the goose extinguishes itself. No one moves. The player plays on desperately now. A final, high-pitched note, thin as stale mead and twice as sour, and then the goose stands and leaves, just like that. No overturned table, no cryptic stares, no passive-aggressive pecks, just a swift exit, like a theatre critic leaving mid-play. Everyone exhales. The silence that follows is almost suspiciously peaceful. The musician stops. His hands are shaking. His flute is bent. No one says anything for a full minute. Then the neighbour, always the brave one, whispers, "Did we win?" You don't know. Maybe you did. Maybe the goose hates flutes. Maybe the melody offended some celestial memory. Maybe you stumbled into a ritual banishment accidentally conducted in C minor. You offer the musician an extra loaf of bread and a blanket. He declines both, says he's leaving town. Tonight. The rest of the evening is calm, almost eerily so. People eat without flinching. Cups are raised. There is laughter, real laughter. And the food actually tastes like food. But the chair the goose sat in remains empty. You watch it all night. And just before you go to bed, you hear it, one long honk, from very, very far away, like the sound of a disappointed god echoing off the stars. You're feeling bold, which is, historically speaking, the emotion that ruins everything. Tonight, instead of your usual assortment of unseasoned food and apologies, you decide to serve something with flair, something colourful, something pickled. You've made relish, not the kind found in jars at polite marketplaces. This is the ancient sort, chopped vegetables, vinegar that might double as punishment, a sprinkle of herbs you can't pronounce, and something purple that may have once been a beet or a curse. It smells sharp. It looks vibrant. It tastes like ambition. You place it in a shallow dish dead center on the table, like an edible offering to flavor itself. And that's your first mistake. The goose enters precisely 7 minutes into dinner, as if it's rehearsed this for contraries. No one says anything, not even the lyre player, who now simply clutches his instrument and stares into the middle distance, humming battle hymns for courage. You bow. You gesture to the chair. The goose takes its place, with the bored elegance of a minor deity who's been forced to attend a school play. Then it sees the relish, and everything changes. It leans forward, slowly, carefully, with all the weight of a scholar inspecting a forbidden text. It tilts its head, first left, then right, then left again. No one breathes. You try to explain softly, quickly, in words that trip over themselves, that it's homemade, that it's new, that it's experimental, that no animals were harmed, unless vegetables count as creatures, in which case many were sacrificed, and you're sorry. The goose does not blink. It pecks, once, then once more. Then it lifts its head and lets out a onk so loudles the plates. The relish dish cracks, not shatters, just cracks, down the middle, like a judgment rendered in pottery. The table goes silent. The neighbour whispers something about prophetic sources. The village elder crosses himself in 4 different regional styles, just to be safe. You remove the dish, quickly, carefully, like it contains bees. The goose watches you. You offer it a fig. It ignores you. You offer it cheese. It looks away. You offer it your seat. It adjusts its feathers, offended by the suggestion. Then, slowly it stands, and walks not out the door, but to the kitchen. This has never happened before. The guests gasp. One faints. You follow, barefoot and trembling, as the goose waddles into your pantry and begins inspecting your shelves. It sniffs the barley, pecks the grain sack, stars at the clay jar of olives for a solid 20 seconds before turning back to you with the kind of look normally reserved for disappointing nephews. Then it leaves. No honk, no thunder, no feathers left behind, just absence. You return to the table. The guests are still frozen in place. The relish dish lies cracked, its contents slowly leaking like forgotten ambition. No one eats. No one drinks. Someone says, "So, maybe just lentils next time." You nod. You clean up. And when you lift the cracked dish, you find something carved into the table beneath it. Faint, shallow, but unmistakable, not that. You don't ask how it got there. You don't serve relish again. Tonight, against your better judgment and the warnings carved into your cutting board, you allow someone new to attend. A traveller. He says he's from the islands, though he doesn't specify which ones. He wears too much linen, speaks with confidence, and introduces himself as a friend of the gods. This, historically, is never good news. Still, you let him in, mostly because he brought dates, real ones, not the dried, sorrowful kind, and also because he claims to have once hugged a minor sea deity. You smile. You seat him near the olives. You try not to think about what's coming. The goose arrives just as the soup is cooling. It doesn't knock, doesn't pause, just glides in with that familiar air of bureaucratic menace and divine patience. Everyone bows. Everyone holds their breath. The flute player disappears entirely, possibly under the table, and then the traveller speaks. "Oh," he says, "you didn't tell me there'd be a goose." You wince. The goose does not respond. It simply climbs onto its usual chair, the good one, the throne of tragic upholstery, and surveys the room like an emperor trying to find the weakest province. The traveller, unfazed, reaches out a hand, not hesitantly, not respectfully. He reaches out with the casual, sun-tanned entitlement of someone who once tried to barter with a sphinx and thinks he won. The room gasps. Time pauses. The soup steams in horror. He pets the goose. Once, just a soft, confident stroke along the neck. The goose does not flinch, but something happens. The fire dims. A breeze sweeps through the room, even though every window is shut. The shadows shift slightly, but enough to imply displeasure. Your skin feels like it's been judged in 3 languages. The traveller chuckles. "I had a goose once," he says. You do not respond. No one does. The cheese begins to sweat again. The amphora hums softly. Then, without warning, the goose stands, turns to face him, and honks. Not loudly, no, this one is soft, measured, the kind of onk that carries millennia of irritation. A honk that might be written about in clay tablets centuries from now. Filed under hubris, see also linen idiot. The traveller blinks, laughs again, then sneezes, and sneezes again, and again. His eyes water. His voice cracks. He grabs for a cup, but spills it. The dates roll off the table. Someone yells he's been goose-touched. You try to help, but he waves you off. "It's nothing," he says, wheezing. "Just some divine dander." He sneezes a 7th time. Somewhere in the distance, a goat collapses. The goose, satisfied, sits again, unbothered. Its feathers untouched. Its beak resting on the edge of your finest bowl. The traveller excuses himself to step outside. He does not return. No one eats the dates. You learn a valuable lesson. Never bring a tourist to a myth, especially not one who pets sacred poultry. You spend the rest of the evening in tense silence, occasionally glancing at the door in case the traveller reappears, transformed into a bush, a fountain, or a cautionary fable. He doesn't. But the next morning, there's a new inscription on your wall, a single line, hastily scratched in neat, goose-foot-shaped indentations. Do not stroke what watches. You were trying to be generous. That was your first mistake. Because in the logic of mortal feasting, 2 desserts mean hospitality. In the logic of divine guests with feathers and opinions, 2 desserts mean something's off. Or worse, you're hiding guilt in sugar. You meant well. The honey cakes were made ahead of time, firm but sweet, dense enough to double as currency. You even tested one not bad, assuming your teeth were feeling brave. Then, feeling oddly festive, or perhaps foolish, you added a second option, fig custard. Warm, fragrant, topped with 3 pine nuts, one of which might have been a beetle, but you decided not to look too closely. The guests arrived and gasped politely. The spread looked impressive. Bread, cheese, a stew of questionable ethics, and not 1 but 2 desserts. Someone clapped. Someone else whispered, "Are we being honoured or punished?" Then came the onk. And you knew. The goose enters, slower than usual, with a gaze like it's already disappointed in your soul's posture. It sees the honey cakes, nods barely, then it sees the custard, and it stops. There's silence. Not polite silence. Sacred silence. The kind of stillness usually reserved for eclipses and extremely suspicious bargains. You clear your throat. I thought variety. It honks. Once. A pine nut rolls off the custard and lands near your foot. You do not pick it up. The goose approaches the desserts. It inspects the honey cakes, pecks one, approves. Then it moves to the custard, pecks again, and pauses. You feel your stomach retreat into your spine. The goose tilts its head, stares at the custard like it contains riddles, like it's waiting for the custard to confess. You try to explain. It's fresh, you whisper. Local figs, goat milk, 2 eggs, 1 escaped, but we coaxed it back. The goose blinks slowly. Then without warning it lifts its foot and tips the custard over. Not violently, just decisively. The bowl lands sideways. The contents splatter. 3 pine nuts, possibly 4, skitter across the table like confused oracles. No one moves. Then the goose picks up a honey cake in its beak and waddles to its seat. A verdict has been rendered. Someone tries to salvage the custard. You stop them. It's done. The rest of the meal proceeds quietly. The goose chews with an air of philosophical finality. The guests eat as little as possible. Unsure what else might be declared unholy. After dinner, someone asks if 2 desserts might have implied desperation. You don't answer. You clean up slowly. The overturned bowl leaves a sticky print on the wood. Circular, fig-scented, and vaguely accusatory. The pine nuts have disappeared. Later, while sweeping, you find one under the goose's chair. It's been cracked in half. Inside, curled like a tiny parchment, is a sliver of paper you didn't put there. It reads, 1 is offering. 2 is strategy. You burn the custard recipe. You never bake 2 things again. The feast is over. Not in the triumphant sense, no one's singing. No one's laughing. No one's calling this the best night of their life, unless they plan to use that line sarcastically. At their own funeral. But the food has been eaten, mostly. The bowls are empty, though one still smells faintly of defeat. The amphora hasn't moved, which you take as a good sign. The goose is still here. You expected it to leave. That's how these things usually end. A honk, a blink, a flap of wings that feels more like punctuation than flight. But not tonight. Tonight, the goose lingers. It sits in the chair, your chair, staring at the hearth like it's waiting for someone to explain fire again. Your guests shuffle awkwardly. Some try to leave. One tries to say goodbye to the goose, but the look it receives in return ages them 5 years. You clear your throat. Would you like anything else? The goose does not respond. You offer leftovers. You offer the good honey. You even offer the ottoman, which is desperate but sincere. Still nothing. It's just sitting. Like the feast wasn't the point. Like this is the point, the awkward, lingering presence of something that knows too much and says too little. You busy yourself with cleanup. Plates scraped. Candles snuffed. The bread that no one touched, you wrap it gently, like maybe tomorrow it'll have meaning again. You wipe the table, careful not to erase any messages that might have been etched in crumbs. Still, the goose does not move. Eventually the guests leave, one by one, with polite bows and haunted glances. The last one whispers, "Bless your house," and then corrects themselves, "May it survive." You are alone. Except, of course, for the goose. You sit across from it. You do not speak. Outside, the wind picks up. A shutter creaks. Somewhere in the distance, a dog regrets being born. You want to ask questions. Was this a test? Was any of it real? Is my soup under divine audit? But you don't. Because at this point you know better. You simply wait. And just when your eyes begin to close, not from comfort, but from the kind of fatigue that clings to your spine like an unpaid debt, the goose stands. No sound. No fanfare. It walks to the door. It stops. It looks back at you. And then, and only then, it onks. Soft, barely more than breath. Less sound than suggestion. Then it leaves, not through the door, not with wings. It just isn't there anymore. You sit alone, at a table that smells like reheated fig failure, in a room that feels one guest too empty. You sigh. You think maybe next time, just soup. You blow out the last candle. And in the faintest scrape of wind against wood, you hear it, don't overdo it. You didn't invite the goose. Not officially. Not with ink or messengers or the ritualistic breadcrumb trail. But apparently, in this world, intention counts. And apparently, hope counts as a kind of summons. And apparently, if you so much as whisper, "Let's keep things simple this time. The gods here, please send the poultry with opinions." You were just trying to host a decent banquet. Not grand, not legendary. Just enough to avoid public shaming and keep your family from asking why no one ever marries into your lineage. You bought grapes. You polished spoons. You even washed the tablecloth, which had survived 2 feasts, 1 funeral, and a mysterious ink-related incident you still don't understand. You handwrote the invitations. 6 of them. Neat script. Light wax seals. Nothing fancy. You gave one to the local scribe, who squinted at it like you'd just offered him a myth. You handed another to the wine merchant, who immediately asked if this meant he had to wear shoes. And then there was the 7th scroll, blank, unaddressed, slipped into your satchel by accident, or fate, or something with feathers and a cruel sense of humour. You didn't notice it until later. It had no name, no seal, just the faint smell of sage and vague regret. You set it aside, forgot about it, and returned to worrying about seating arrangements, and whether the stew would taste like forgiveness or punishment. That night, the wind changed. Not much. Just enough for the candles to flicker in unison, for the cat to leave the room unprompted, for the door to creak even though it was closed. The blank scroll was gone, and deep inside your ribcage, something began to hum, like a very old instrument being tuned by an invisible hand. You told yourself, it's nothing. You told yourself, maybe the scroll fell. Maybe the cat took it. You told yourself many things. You did not tell yourself the truth, because the truth was already waddling toward you, wrapped in silence and feathers and favors, and the promise of questions no mortal wants to answer. The banquet begins. Your guests arrive on time, carrying modest offerings and excessive stories. The wine flows. The bread holds. The stew does its best. You start to believe this might work. Then the goose arrives. No knock. No flourish. Just presence. It carries nothing. It wears nothing. It says nothing. But in its beak is a crumpled scroll, your scroll. The one you didn't send. The one you didn't write. It drops it on the table. Everyone stares. You want to speak, but your tongue feels like it's made of chalk and shame. The goose looks at you, not with anger, not with delight, just expectation. And then it sits, not on a cushion, not on a chair, on the table itself between the cheese plate and the unfinished prayers, and waits. For what? You're not sure. But it's watching, listening. And as the stew cools and your guests pretend to eat and not tremble, you begin to understand you didn't send the invitation, but you sent enough. It begins innocently. Well, as innocently as anything can begin, when a goose with unknowable powers has made itself the centerpiece of your banquet. You're trying to slice cheese. Your hand is shaking slightly, because the knife was never sharp and your nerves are now sharper than steel. You set the wedges down on a plate, careful to make them look effortless, as if you always arranged dairy like sacred geometry. The goose watches. Then it honks. Not loudly, not aggressively, just once. And you realize it's not a greeting. It's a question. Your guests pretend not to notice. One begins humming. Another becomes very interested in their own fingernails. The wine merchant spills something deliberately, hoping for an excuse to leave the room. No one moves. You glance at the goose. It tilts its head toward the stew. You step forward. Carefully, like the floor might ask for answers next. You lift the ladle, and stir slowly like you're giving the ingredients a final warning. The goose watches. You taste the stew. Too bland. Just barley, carrots, and a faint suggestion of meat. You add a pinch of salt. The goose blinks. You add another. The goose honks again. Short, clipped, displeased. And now the room is silent again, the kind of silence that follows a particularly intense philosophical argument or an accident involving honey, wax, and bad intentions. You try to recover. You gesture toward the spice shelf, hoping this will pass as transparency. You offer the pepper, the dried thyme, even the bottle that only says not for Tuesdays. The goose pecks the salt. Twice. You think it wants more. You add more. Now the stew tastes like regret marinated in anxiety. It's far too salty. You know it. Everyone knows it. But the goose is satisfied. Maybe. You serve it. Everyone eats slowly, sipping wine between bites, like they're trying to dilute their tongues. The wine merchant begins sweating. The scribe has tears in his eyes, not from emotion, but from sodium. The goose chews, or seems to. There is no mouth movement, only judgment. You watch it peer into the bowl, as if decoding a prophecy hidden in broth. Then it looks up at you, and honks. And you understand, though you wish you didn't, that this was the test. Not the food. Not the feast. Not the scroll. The salt. Did you respect it? Did you understand it? Did you hesitate? Yes. And that apparently matters. Later, long after the guests have gone and someone has tried, unsuccessfully, to water down the leftover stew, you return to the table. The goose is gone, but near its bowl is a single salt crystal, unnaturally large, glinting like it's been carved, not formed. You taste it. It's perfect. And in the air around you, faint and echoing, you hear the question, what did you learn? You warned them. You told every guest plainly, repeatedly, sometimes in song, don't talk to the goose. Don't meet its eyes. Don't interpret its honks. Don't ask if it wants anything. Don't ask if it's angry. If it wants something, it will make you know. But someone always thinks they're special. Tonight's offender is a philosopher's apprentice. He's 17. He carries a scroll under one arm, and arrogance under the other. He's been in 3 debates and lost all of them, but tells people he won by redefining the terms. He's new in town. The meal is going surprisingly well. The stew, while a touch salty from last time's incident, is passable. The wine is flowing. The bread only hurts your mouth a little. The goose is present, yes, but quiet, settled in its chair, watching, always watching, but not pecking, not judging. And then the boy speaks. I believe the goose is asking about metaphysics. Everyone stops. You close your eyes. You pray not to any god, but to the concept of silence itself. Too late. The apprentice turns to the goose, smiles smug and confident, and says, are you implying the stew represents existential dread? The goose honks. Not angrily, not loudly, just once, quiet, precise. The guest drops their spoon. The apprentice laughs. Ah, so we agree. No one else laughs. The goose stands and begins walking, slowly, around the table. Its feet make soft thuds, like punctuation marks in a sentence you're not sure you want to finish. The apprentice watches, clearly pleased, as if he's been granted a debate with eternity itself. The goose stops beside him, stares. There's a silence that hums, that vibrates the candle flames. That makes the soup ripple, yes, visibly ripple, even though no one's touched it. Then the goose honks again. The apprentice opens his mouth to reply, but can't. He tries. His jaw moves. No sound. He tries again. A squeak, a wheeze. Nothing. The goose turns, returns to its seat, sits. The apprentice stares at his bowl. No one speaks for the rest of the meal. Afterward, he scribbles furiously onto his scroll, but the words don't line up. The ink runs. He begins muttering to himself, something about soup as epistemology. You decide not to engage. The soup is ruined. No one finishes their bowl. Some pretend they were full. Others simply slide the bowl away, as if proximity invites judgment. When the meal ends, The apprentice tries to thank the goose. It honks once more. His pen snaps in half. He leaves. You never see him again, but days later you hear a rumor, a boy shouting at a pond, trying to debate with ducks. You believe it. You return to your kitchen. You lift the soup pot. The liquid is still, but just beneath the surface, barely visible, are words. Listen. Don't answer. Ask ChatGPT, there's something wrong with the air tonight. Not the temperature, though it is oddly lukewarm, like bathwater you forgot was running. Not the smell, though something earthy lingers, like wet parchment, or ambition left in the sun. It's the air itself, too still, like it's waiting for a sound that hasn't yet decided if it wants to be heard. You try to ignore it. The table is set. Bread, not too crusty this time. Cheese, mild, humble, unlikely to offend. Fruit, apples, slightly bruised, appropriate. You've made no soup. After last time, soup feels like a provocation. And still you feel it. A pressure, a hush, a presence. The goose is already there. No arrival, no knock. It's just there, sitting calmly in the chair you didn't place, beside the spot where no one sits. You nod. It does not honk. You begin to worry. The guests arrive. Slowly, one brings nuts. Another brings dried figs wrapped in hope. Everyone moves a little too carefully, like actors in a dream who aren't sure what the scene is. And still no sound from the goose. You serve the food. You pretend not to notice it watching. And then, just as someone lifts a cup, the room changes. No noise. Just change. Every candle flickers at once. The shadows shift inward. The walls feel too close. And in your mind, not in your ears, you hear it. A question. You don't know the words. They're older than your language. Older than bread. But the feeling is clear. It wants to know who you are. Not your name. Not your job. Who you are. Your guests stop moving. One drops a fig. It lands without a sound. You try to breathe quietly, as if your lungs might reveal too much. The goose does not move, but it's asking somehow. You feel it, not in your head, in your bones. Your thoughts begin to flutter, unspooling like thread in a windstorm. Am I the host? Am I the servant? Am I the joke? You look at your plate. It's empty. You look at your hands. They are shaking. You glance at the goose. It tilts its head, and the moment passes. The pressure lifts. The air returns. Your guests begin to move again, like they've forgotten what just happened. But you haven't. You know something was asked, and worse, something answered. Not with words, not with sound, with stillness. Later that night, you find a napkin folded strangely under the table. Not yours. Not anyone's. Inside, drawn in crumbs and what might be ink or wine or blood, is a spiral. In the center, a dot, and a single word. Enough. You sit by the hearth. You do not sleep. You wait for morning, and wonder what the next question will be. You didn't put the mirror there. You're sure of it. You've lived in this house long enough to memorize every flaw. The creaky floorboard under the window. The draft that always smells faintly of onions. The nail in the pantry that insists on snagging your sleeve. And yet, somehow tonight there is a mirror. Tall, oval, framed in wood too dark to name. Leaning against the wall behind the goose's usual seat, like it's always been there, and you're simply the one who forgot. You try not to stare at it. It's dinner time. The bread is round and reliable. The stew has been replaced with something safer, roasted roots, the edible kind. You've arranged the plates with nervous precision. Even the cheese looks humble, like it's apologizing for being fermented. The goose arrives. Of course it does. Tonight it does not honk. It simply walks in, settles into its chair, and for the first time looks directly into the mirror. You feel it before you see it. The chill, the silence thicker than usual, the flickering of candles that aren't near any breeze. And then you glance at the glass. The goose is there, as expected. But you aren't. The mirror shows the table, the food, the guests, the goose. But where you sit there is nothing. No reflection. Not a blur. Not a shadow. Nothing. You freeze. A guest coughs politely. Another lifts a cup with deliberate slowness, pretending not to notice the metaphysical absence unfolding behind you. You smile weakly. You try to chew something. It tastes like questions. Then the goose turns not toward you, but toward your absence, and honks. Everyone jumps. You flinch. But the mirror doesn't. Still nothing. And now you notice something worse. The goose's reflection is wrong. Not in shape, not in motion, in expression. It's smiling. Not the way animals smile, not a beak twitch or a feather fluff. A knowing smile. The kind you've only seen on gods and very successful liars. You stand. So does the reflection, but not yours. The goose. In the mirror. Standing upright. Wings folded like arms. Head cocked. Smiling still. You sit. So does it. You look at the real goose. It is still seated. Still silent. You look back at the mirror. It is watching you. No one else seems to notice. The meal continues. You taste nothing. Later, the guests leave quickly, as always. One mutters, "Lovely dinner." Very existential. Another leaves a coin on the table for no reason. You approach the mirror. You raise your hand. The reflection does not follow. It tilts its head, and then fades. Gone. The mirror now shows what it should. The empty room. The quiet hearth. Your tired face. You sit by the goose chair, alone, and find, resting on the cushion, a single piece of broken mirror. It reflects nothing. Not the room. Not your hand. Not even the candlelight. You wrap it in cloth, and place it beside the salt from last week, just in case. You were hungry. That's the beginning of most bad decisions. And this one was no exception. Tonight's meal was humble. A plate of boiled lentils, an herb cake shaped like regret, and a bit of roasted onion, slightly charred, slightly intentional. You'd cooked it yourself. You told yourself that made it sacred. You told yourself that meant control. You set the food out. Small servings. Simple colours. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worthy of thunder or transformation. And then, as always, the goose arrived. It didn't knock. It didn't pause. It didn't blink last 5 minutes. You tried to act natural. You offered the food. And without ceremony, the goose leaned forward and took the first bite. Not a honk. Not a gesture. Just a bite. Of your meal. Of your plate. Of your food. And in that moment, the room changed. The walls felt closer. The bread went dry in your mouth. The candlelight turned slightly green. You blinked, and for half a second, the plate in front of you was gone, replaced by something else. Not food. Not exactly. It was a memory. You smelled it before you understood it. The scent of wood smoke and damp grass. The sharp sting of crushed mint. The distant clatter of childhood dishes. You saw just for an instant your mother's hands, worn and warm, ladling stew into a bowl you hadn't seen in years. Then it was gone. Just a plate again. The goose looked up and honked. But not at you. At the onion. The onion split in two. On its own. Inside, something shimmered, not juice, not oil. Something older. You leaned closer. You saw something in the layers. A face. Familiar. Yours, maybe. Or not quite yours. And almost you. From a moment that never fully happened. You looked at the goose. It blinked slowly. Your guests chewed carefully, as if their mouths might reveal secrets. One reached for wine, then stopped, confused, as if they'd forgotten how cups work. You said nothing. What would you say? That a bird just excavated your memory from a vegetable. That your dinner just judged your childhood. That an onion told you something your family never did. You ate slowly, without tasting. The goose did not eat again. It simply watched. And when the meal ended, it walked to the door, paused, and pecked once at the frame. A knock, or a signature. Then it left. You gathered the plates. Yours felt lighter than it should. You found the onion skin, still resting on the table. You unfolded it. It crackled like paper. On the inside, written in nothing but absence, were the words, "You remember enough. For now." You tried to use a fork. You told yourself it was just a tool, just a bit of carved wood with 3 little tines, handmade by a cousin who once mistook his own boot for a cat. It's bent at the tip and has a splinter that catches on soft bread, but tonight you needed something solid, something normal. So you used the fork. That was your second mistake. The first, of course, was thinking you'd have a normal dinner at all. The table was quiet. The meal was warm. You'd made lentil cakes with herbs and a little wedge of pressed goat cheese, which you arranged with the delicate hope of someone auditioning for safety. The goose arrived late. Not dramatically. Just enough to imply it had considered not coming and chose to come anyway. A silent threat disguised as a favour. You nodded. It did not nod back. And then you picked up your fork. Not thinking. Not planning. Just habit. You cut into the lentil cake carefully, politely. The fork creaked. Not from effort. From resistance. It bent. Just slightly, but undeniably. You looked at it. It looked back, or might as well have. The fork felt warmer now, like it had been held too long. But you'd only just picked it up. The goose tilted its head. You tried again. Gently. You lifted a bite, and the fork twitched. Not dropped. Not pulled. Just shifted, as if something inside it disapproved of this moment. As if utensils, too, have rules. You looked at your plate. The food seemed fine, steaming gently, obedient. You looked at the goose. It was looking at the fork. And then it honked. The fork bent. Not snapped, not broke. Just curled in on itself, slow and deliberate, like it had finally admitted a truth about the nature of control. It now resembled a spiral. Useless, decorative, accusatory. You set it down. The cheese began to sweat. A guest whispered, "It's disrespectful to pierce the humble." You didn't ask what that meant. You ate with your fingers after that. Everyone did. No one spoke of forks. No one touched knives. A spoon slid off the table on its own. No one picked it up. By the end of the meal, the table looked less like a feast and more like a shrine to surrender. When the guests left, one gave you a look, not pity, not fear, just recognition. The look of someone who's also once been judged by cutlery. You stayed up cleaning. The fork remained on the table, twisted like a question mark. You tried to straighten it. It sprang back. You tried again. It warmed in your hand and whispered, in the way only wooden things can, "You don't need to control everything." You wrapped it in cloth. You placed it beside the salt, the mirror shard, and the onion skin. Your shrine of mistakes. You tried humour. You don't know why. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was wine. Maybe it was the unbearable weight of too many goose visits and not enough explanation. Whatever the reason, tonight you thought foolishly that laughter might help. You'd made chickpea stew. Again, it's predictable. It doesn't provoke. It tastes like apology and cooks like surrender. The bread is flatter than usual, possibly due to your emotional state or a missing ingredient. Either way, it doesn't rise, much like your spirits. The goose arrives mid-conversation. The topic was fences, or dreams, or dream fences, the kind that keep things in but don't exist. You try to make a joke. You turn to your guests and say, "Let's hope tonight the goose is just here for the ambience." A chuckle from one guest, nervous then. The goose stops. It was halfway to its chair. It turns, looks at you, then at the table, then at you again. The silence that follows is not complete. There are sounds, a spoon tapping softly, the wind whistling through the chimney, a distant owl reconsidering its night plans, but they are outside the silence. Around it, the core is still, dense, immovable. You smile, not a real smile, the kind that's mostly teeth and regret. The goose moves to its chair, sits, and does not look away from you. Dinner continues. No one speaks, or chews, or swallows with confidence. Then, halfway through the stew, the goose lets out a wonk. Short, flat, ambiguous. It's a reaction. You don't know what it means. Was it a laugh? Was it an insult? Was it a divine request for better material? You offer a second joke, this time smaller. At least the bread's too flat to offend, nothing. Not even a blink. A guest coughs. Someone drops a fork. The air grows heavy, like it's been told a secret it didn't want to keep. The goose stands, walks to your chair, stops beside you, and pecks the table, once, gently. Then it walks back, sits, and closes its eyes. Everyone interprets this differently. The wine merchant takes it as forgiveness. The philosopher believes it's disapproval. The cheese bringer quietly excuses herself and doesn't return. You sit very still. You do not joke again. Later, when the meal ends and the last crumbs are swept, you find a note under your plate. You didn't write it. The handwriting is yours, but older. Like something you will write someday, once you understand more than you currently do. It says, "The gods laugh," but not at what you think. You fold the note, place it beside the fork, the salt, the onion skin, the mirror shard. You sit by the hearth. You do not smile, but you almost do. You thought it was over. The meal ended. The guests left. The stew sat cold in its bowl, congealing into the shape of your worst emotional habits. The goose had departed, no final glance, no onk, not even a half-hearted peck at the cheese. Just absence. You were grateful for the silence. And then you went to bed. You didn't expect comfort. Your mattress is a burlap sack filled with straw and decisions you regret. Your blanket smells like dust and old parsley. The pillow is lumpy, possibly sentient. But it's yours. You lie down. And feel it. Soft, deliberate. A feather. On your pillow. White. Long. Still warm somehow. As if it had just been part of something alive. You pick it up gently, like a relic, like it might tell you a secret if you breathe too closely. You look around the room. No goose, no footprints, no open window, just the feather, and the silence. Not peaceful, not threatening, just the kind that exists when something has already happened, and the air hasn't decided how to feel about it yet. You lie back down, but the feather stays in your hand. You can't let go of it. You try. You drop it. It lands on the pillow again. You toss it across the room. It is on your pillow when you turn back. You place it on the shelf. It falls, softly, back, onto your pillow. You stop trying. You lie there with the feather in your hand, as if you've been given something sacred or inconvenient or both. And then, just as you're drifting into something like sleep, you hear it. A whisper. Not outside. Not inside. Just there. Right between your ear and your thoughts. You hosted. That's all it says. Not praise. Not warning. Just acknowledgement. You hosted. You close your eyes. You dream of doors that don't open, and guests who arrive before the house is built. In the morning, the feather is gone. In its place on your pillow is a small circular burn. Not hot, not painful, just present. You touch it. It hums. You get up. You make bread. You don't ask questions. You prepare anyway. By now it's habit. A strange ritual of plates and pauses, of folding napkins with silent apologies, of laying out a place setting that knows more than you do. Tonight, you roast parsnips. You add just enough honey to make them feel loved, but not enough to be accused of ambition. The bread is soft. The oil is fresh. The wine is unremarkable. You've done your best to be forgettable. The table is set for 6. You have 5 guests, and 1 empty seat. The seat, the one the goose always takes. The guests arrive with cautious cheer. They speak a little louder than usual, like people trying to keep the dark away with syllables. One tells a story about a dog and a stolen sandal. Another laughs too hard at a joke that wasn't finished. You smile. You pour wine. You don't mention the chair, but everyone sees it. Everyone notices. They just don't say it. The meal begins. The food is warm. The flavor's safe. You watch the door. It does not open. You don't hear footsteps. You don't hear feathers. You don't feel the shift in pressure. You don't feel anything but the space where something usually is. Halfway through the meal, the philosopher leans in and whispers, "Do you think it's angry?" You don't answer. The bread tastes like paper. Someone spills oil. Someone else apologizes to the table. then to the air, then to the olive itself. You try to laugh. It doesn't come out. And then dessert. You didn't make two. You remember the lesson. You've made one a simple date pudding. Modest, humble, carefully bland. You place it in the center of the table, and the room waits, as if expecting the table to shake, the pudding to be split. A honk, a question, a gust of feathers. Nothing, just pudding, just pièces chewing like their jaws forgot the rhythm. The evening ends early. No one lingers. They thank you politely. No one says, "Wonderful meal." No one says, "I hope we do this again." One says, "I'll light a candle." Another says, "If you hear anything, let me know." You nod. You clear the plates. You wipe the table. You look at the empty chair. And for the first time, it looks empty. Not sacred. Not reserved. Just a chair. You almost sit in it. You almost do. But you don't. Instead, you stand beside it, hands resting on the back, and say softly, "I noticed." That's all. You blow out the candles. You sit by the hearth. You stare at the flicker of shadow where something should have been. And just as you start to drift not to sleep, but to a kind of stillness, a breeze brushes the back of your neck. Not cold. Not warm. Just real. You look up. The chair is still empty. But on the table in front of it, there's a single breadcrumb, still warm. You place it gently beside the salt, the mirror shard, the onion skin, the fork, the note, and smile, just a little. You were looking for turnips. That's how most sacred artifacts get discovered, not by scholars in robes, but by people who just wanted soup. The garden was soft that morning, damp from last night's storm. The clouds still lingered like old rumours, and the air smelled of wet soil and mild regret. You brought your basket, your small spade, and your quiet intention. To dig only enough for dinner and nothing else. You found the turnips, and something else. It was buried shallow, as if the earth hadn't meant to hide it. A corner of baked clay. You scratched at it. It scratched back. Eventually you pulled out a tablet, rectangular, rough-edged, slightly cracked in one corner, about the size of your hand. If your hand were carrying a secret, you turned it over. It had writing. Cuneiform, maybe, or something trying to be. Not etched impressed, like whoever made it didn't write with a stylus, but pressed the letters in with intention. The symbols curved and looped and refused to mean anything. But you knew, somehow, that it was a guest list. You brought it inside. Set it on the table, stared. Then, as if summoned by ritual, the candle blew out. The wind stopped moving. The cat hid under the bed, and the goose arrived. Not from the door, not from the window, just from presence. You blinked. There it was, standing beside the tablet, staring at it. Then at you, then at the tablet again, and then it honked. Lightning struck. Not outside, not the sky. Inside in your fireplace. No thunder, just light. Sudden and furious, burning a message into the suit. You turned to look. There it was, you forgot someone. You turned back. The tablet was glowing. The symbols rearranged themselves, not visibly, but you knew they had. As if memory itself had been rewritten. You looked closer. There were now 7 names. You didn't recognize any of them, except one. Your own. You tried to speak. Nothing came out but breath. The goose sat, waited. Dinner wasn't ready. There was no table set, no guests, just you, the goose, and a clay invitation addressed to a moment you hadn't planned. You fetched bread, the old kind, crumbly, embarrassing. You poured wine, weak and half vinegar. The goose watched you, didn't judge, not yet, but it would. You sat across from it. You raised your glass. You said nothing. It honked once. Soft. And just like that, the message in the suit vanished. The air warmed again. The cat returned, casually pretending it hadn't fled. You looked at the tablet. It was cold now. Ordinary. Just clay. Except for the small detail scratched into the bottom corner, a new symbol. One you hadn't noticed. A feather. You placed it beside the others: the fork, the mirror shard, the onion skin, the breadcrumb, the salt. The goose left without eating. You finished the bread anyway. It wasn't good, but somehow it tasted correct. You were trying to make bread. Not the ceremonial kind. Not festival bread with almonds and hope. Just the plain, dense rectangle that won't betray you mid-meal. Something to hold stew. Something to hide behind. You followed the recipe. Mostly a handful of flour, some water, a pinch of patience, and a rising agent that never quite works. You kneaded it on the table, humming a song that might have been about fields or might have been about fatigue. Then you let it rest. You lit the oven. You shaped the dough. And that's when you noticed it. The colour was wrong. Too grey. Too matte. Like it had been rolled out of memory, not flour. It smelled not of yeast, but of rain-soaked stone. You poked it. It pushed back. Only a little. Just enough to make you pretend it hadn't. You blinked. Looked again. Now there were markings. Not finger-shaped. Not spoon-shaped. Letters. Or symbols. Or cracks that were pretending. You leaned in. And saw a name. Not yours. But not unfamiliar either. The kind of name that shows up in old songs. The kind your aunt once said in a dream and then swore she didn't. The oven was ready. You should have stopped. You didn't. You baked it. And when you pulled it out brown, steaming, stiff, the loaf had split perfectly down the center. Inside, not bread, clay, still soft, still warm, still breathing. You touched it. Gently. The surface gave slightly, as though waiting for a signature. Then the goose arrived. It walked straight in. Didn't look at the loaf. Looked at you. Then at the loaf. Then back at you. Then it sat. And waited. You brought it the loaf. Set it down. It leaned in. Pecked once. Then once more. The markings shifted. Just slightly. As if the message hadn't been finished. As if the act of feeding or offering was the ink. The goose honked. The candle nearest the table went out. You sat and tried to eat the corner of the loaf. It tasted like forgetting something important. It crumbled the way promises do, quietly and without protest. When the goose left, it did not look back. You returned to the loaf. The name was gone. In its place, a spiral. You touched it. It didn't smear. It hummed. You didn't clean the table that night. You just added the bread to the shelf, next to the fork. The feather, the mirror, the note, the salt, the onion skin, the breadcrumb. You told yourself tomorrow just soup. You didn't believe it. You thought it best to stay quiet. You thought, if I don't say it, maybe it won't be real. Maybe names are like seeds, only dangerous if planted. Or maybe names are like matches, only ruinous if struck. Tonight was meant to be uneventful. You swept the hearth. You boiled lentils. You tried very hard not to rearrange the artifacts on the shelf. The mirror shard winked at you anyway. The fork wobbled once. The salt hummed, which you now accept as normal. You laid the table with slow hands. Fewer guests tonight. Just one, actually. You didn't invite them. But the invitation was sent. You think maybe you are the invitation now. The goose did not arrive, but the tablet did. It was sitting on your stool by the fire, upright, clean, dry but not dusty. It had changed again. You didn't see it change, but it had. The symbols were no longer just swirls and threats. They were words now, almost legible, almost yours. You touched it, warm. You read it. It listed names. Not many. One of them yours. Not the name people call you. The other name. The one you heard once, whispered by your mother in her sleep. The one that shows up in dreams spelled backward and burning. You said it aloud. That was your third mistake. The hearth flared. Not big, not dangerous. Just bright. As if the fire wanted to hear it too. You looked up. The goose was there, perched on the windowsill. Inside, it did not move. It did not blink. It did not honk. It just was. You said the name again. The goose tilted its head. You felt it in your bones, a shift, Like something that had been waiting a long time finally found the right door. The goose stepped down, walked to the tablet, tapped it once with its beak. The name vanished. In its place, a question mark. Not drawn. Impressed. Pressed down so deep the tablet cracked a little. The goose sat. You did not speak again. You served lentils. You did not eat. The goose did not eat. But you both sat, bowls full, questions untouched. Later, after the goose left again, without sound, without signal, you found the tablet cold and blank. But at the bottom, in the smallest, faintest line of text, you are now expected. You placed it gently beside the loaf, next to the fork, the feather, the mirror, the salt, the onion skin, the note, the breadcrumb. The shelf is almost full. You stare at it and wonder what you're collecting. There's something you've come to understand about the divine. Nothing they use ever stays where you put it. You left the tablet on the shelf. You were sure of that. You tucked it gently beside the loaf, let it lean slightly against the mirror shard so it wouldn't tip. It was late. The room was quiet. You had wiped the table twice, once for crumbs, once for memory, and you told yourself firmly that the strange hum in your ribs was indigestion and not omen. This morning the tablet was on the table, not just on it centered, perfectly aligned, balanced between the salt dish and the bowl of yesterday's withered apples. No cracks, no smudges, and no dust, even though everything else around it looked like it had been sneezed on by history itself. You stared at it. It stared back. The list had changed. It hadn't the night before. You'd memorized the names partly because you couldn't sleep, partly because they had the rhythm of spells disguised as people. Some you knew. Some you didn't. One was yours, and one was scratched out a thick gouge through what might once have been something gentle. But now, there were 9 names. You blinked. There were 10. You did not blink again. You stepped closer. You held your breath. You stared until your eyes watered and the letters blurred, not from transformation, but from exhaustion. The names shimmered, not visibly, not with light, with meaning, like they wanted to be read, but only by someone who understood that reading isn't always safe. You mouthed the first name. It vanished. You mouthed the second. It changed. The third name was yours again. You stopped. The goose was not in the room, but it was. Its presence had become a familiar kind of absence. The way someone can leave their coat on a chair, and you still feel like they're watching you from the hallway. You knew it was nearby. You felt it in the shift of the shadows, in the way the candle bent left instead of right, in the quiet groan of the floorboard that no one had stepped on. You picked up the tablet. It was heavier than it looked. Warm again. Slightly damp, though the air was dry and the windows sealed. You carried it to the corner, the one you've started to think of as the altar, though no one ever told you to call it that. You placed it gently beside the rest, the fork, the feather, the onion skin, the cracked loaf, the mirror shard, the note, the salt, the breadcrumb. You looked again. Now 11 names. You whispered nothing. You breathed softly. The candle sputtered once. And then, only then, the goose walked in. It didn't look at you. It looked at the shelf, tilted its head, sat on the floor, not the chair. It waited. You did, too. The names on the tablet did not stop moving. There's always one. One guest who shows up late, or early, or in the exact moment where everything has gone too quiet. One who wasn't invited, wasn't warned about, and somehow already knows where the ladle goes and which side of the bread to tear. You hadn't expected anyone new tonight. After the last few visits, the bending utensils, the whispering fire, the infinite spiral of guest names that rearranged themselves like bored puzzle pieces you had hoped for a night without additions. You'd made lentil cakes again. They're predictable, inoffensive, and easy to apologize for. You'd salted them with restraint. You'd laid out plates like puzzle pieces. The goose was already seated, not honking, not blinking, just occupying the room like a rumor too solid to deny. The tablet, now seemingly stabilized at 12 names, sat near the end of the shelf. Your shelf. The shelf you didn't mean to build. The shelf you didn't ask for, but now dust daily, with reverence and mild dread. Then came the knock. Not a loud one, not dramatic, just a soft, inconsistent rhythm, like someone tapping with one finger, or like a thought trying to get in through your skull. You opened the door. A man stood there, middle-aged, or pretending to be, hair too neat, hands too clean. He smiled as if he'd practiced, wore a cloak that didn't quite match the weather, and eyes that didn't quite match the room. He held no offering, no bottle, no bread, just himself, and the quiet assumption that his place was already set. "I believe I'm expected," he said. You didn't speak. Behind you, the candle dimmed slightly. The goose looked up, but did not move. The man stepped inside. No hesitation. He looked around not with curiosity, but with inventory. He nodded at the shelf, smiled at the tablet, and then, without invitation, sat down. Not in the empty chair. In your chair, the one you always sit in, the one that creaks in the third plank and smells faintly of rosemary and burnt hope. You stood for a moment too long, then sat beside him, where no chair was, because somehow there was now a stool. You didn't remember putting it there. You served him first, not because you wanted to, because it felt like something would go wrong if you didn't. He ate without comment, no praise, no thanks, no chewing sounds, just mechanical consumption, like someone fulfilling a contract he hadn't written. You watched. The goose watched. Even the mirror shard on the shelf seemed to angle slightly in his direction. He looked at you once mid-bite and said, "You forgot me again." Not accusing, not angry, just stating. You didn't ask who he was. You already knew you wouldn't understand the answer. After the meal, he stood. He placed one single lentil uneaten on the table. Then he left. The goose followed him with its eyes, then returned to stillness. You added the lentil to the shelf. Didn't ask how, just did. And the tablet now had 13 names. It was supposed to be ordinary bread. That's what you told yourself anyway. After the incident with the clay loaf and the memory onion and the guest who placed a single lentil on your table, like a bookmark you were too scared to read, you craved simplicity. Something dry, something crusty, something that made no claims and delivered even less. You didn't even need it yourself this time. Just mixed the ingredients, let the lump sit in a bowl like a sulking animal, and hoped that if you baked it quietly enough, no symbols would try to crawl across the surface. It emerged from the oven looking innocent, pale, a little cracked on top, the kind of loaf you might expect to find abandoned in a monastery kitchen, already half-eaten by a monk with doubts. You left it to cool. You didn't light a candle. You didn't set the table, but the room still knew. The goose was already seated when you returned. Again, no sound, no movement of air, no footsteps, just presence. The kind of presence that turns the air thick, like someone dropped an extra dimension and forgot to pick it up. You sat down. The bread waited. You didn't slice it, didn't dare. You broke it with your hands. It crumbled reluctantly, as if annoyed to be touched. The inside was soft, steamless, slightly damp, like it had been crying alone before you entered. You took a bite, and it began. Not loudly, not all at once. The message didn't arrive like thunder or prophecy. It arrived like a word you'd always known, but never bothered to pronounce. It started with taste salt, but not sea salt. Memory salt, then grain, but old grain. Something that grew in soil now buried beneath cities, that don't remember their own names. Then came the words, not spoken, not written, just known. The bread told you things. About harvests that failed on purpose. About guest lists carved into stone with bone. About feasts that were not meals, but rituals to remind the gods they were still needed. It told you about the first host. Not you, not even mortal who lit a fire in an empty field and waited 3 days before the goose came. It told you why the fork bends, why the mirror forgets, why soup should never be served without asking the wind. You chewed slowly. Not because of texture, but reverence. The guests around you didn't remember inviting them were all chewing too, slowly, thoughtfully, as if their bites also came with footnotes. You looked at the goose. It was not eating. It was watching you like someone reading a letter they wrote centuries ago and finally received back. You swallowed. The room shifted. Nothing moved, but everything aligned, just slightly, as if someone had taken the house and nudged it 1 inch closer to a truth too big to name. You finished your piece. You did not reach for another. When you looked down at your hands, they were dusted with flour and the faintest trace of ink, though you hadn't written anything today. You saved a crumb, placed it carefully on the shelf, beside the others. The goose closed its eyes, not in sleep, in memory. It started with the salt. You weren't even near the tablet when it happened. You were sweeping under the shelf, brushing away the soft, disintegrating suggestions of past crumbs. And when you looked up, the salt had moved. Not far, just a few centimeters to the left, just enough to ruin the careful symmetry you'd spent the morning adjusting. You reached out to slide it back, but something gave you pause. The tablet, sitting quiet and square as ever, had changed again. You could tell even before you looked. It didn't glow. It didn't tremble. It didn't hum like last time. But it felt different, the way a sealed door feels different after it's been opened and closed again behind someone else. You picked it up, carefully, like you might be asked to answer for it later. The names were still there. 13, maybe 14. You stopped counting last week, but now, below the names, was a list. Not of people, of objects. You recognized the first few instantly: the bent fork, the shard of mirror, the loaf, the feather. Each one named like a character. Not a description, a title. With purpose, with presence. You scanned down. There it was, the salt. Written clearly, firmly, as if it had always been there, and you had only now managed to remember it. Then, a new one appeared, right before your eyes. You didn't blink. You didn't move. You didn't even breathe, not properly. You just stared as the letters impressed themselves into the clay, with deliberate, almost disappointed finality. The broom. You looked down at the broom in your hands. Straw. Fraying. Still coated with the dust of the shelf's underside. You hadn't thought much of it. You've used it for years. Its handle bears the dents of 4 winters' worth of sighing. You tried to set the tablet down. Your hands wouldn't move. You tried to let go of the broom. Your fingers tightened instead. The candle to your left flickered. The goose had arrived. Not at the table. At the shelf. It stood in front of it, not touching, not pecking, just present. Its neck arched slightly, and for a moment you thought it might bow, or rise. Then it looked at you. No sound, but you heard it anyway. You're not just the host. The words came not as voice but sensation, like a pressure in the chest, or the ringing in your ears when you forget how silence works. You placed the broom beside the salt. It did not fall over. You placed the tablet beside it. It did not cool down. Later that night you woke with ink on your hands again. You had not written, but you had dreamed of writing. You couldn't remember what, only that the pen had moved like it knew where it was going, and you were the one catching up. When you checked the shelf again before dawn, a new item had joined the list, the floorboard. You didn't ask which one. You already knew. You hadn't written anything. Not a note, not a list, not even the usual scrap of parchment where you scribble vague ideas like stew, or not onions again. The firewood hadn't been brought in yet. The vegetables were still stubbornly unpeeled, and your only clear thought for the day had been don't think too hard. It wasn't a feast day. It wasn't any kind of day. Just another ordinary patch of time you hoped to fill with something warm and uneventful. But then, someone knocked. Not on the door. On your sense of certainty. It came in the form of a messenger, not one you recognized, not anyone from town. Young, with 2 short sleeves and 2 long legs, holding a scroll that looked both ancient and freshly written. He said your name like it tasted unfamiliar in his mouth. And when you asked who sent him, he only shrugged and said, "They said you'd know. You didn't." You took the scroll anyway. It was sealed with wax. The wax bore no emblem, just a simple spiral, unbroken, unassuming, unmistakable. Your hands hesitated. You broke the seal. The parchment inside smelled faintly of herbs and damp stone, not ink clay. The message was short and precise. Dinner. Tonight. You're expected. Nothing else. No name, no location, no signature. You looked up to ask the boy a question, but he was gone. Not walking away. Not vanishing. Just gone. As if your eyes had invented him briefly. To hand you a task you didn't remember accepting, you turned to the room. The table was already set. Not by you. The plates were placed with ritualistic precision. The utensils, including the twisted fork, had returned to their familiar places. The candle was already lit, its flame steady despite the window being slightly open. You hadn't planned a meal, but the pot on the stove was simmering. You hadn't touched it, but it smelled of lentils and rosemary and memory, a scent so familiar you forgot to question its origin. And then, without ceremony or the usual shift in atmosphere, the goose entered. It didn't onk. It didn't acknowledge you. It simply sat, as if the seat had called it. You sat down as well. You didn't eat. You didn't speak. You unrolled the parchment again. The words had changed. Now it read, "You accepted the invitation the moment you knew it was for you." You did not remember doing that, but you could not deny it either. At the edge of the room, the tablet glowed faintly, not urgently, just enough to remind you it was always watching. The scroll crumbled gently in your hand, not dramatically, not into ash, just into softness like something that was never meant to last. You set the pieces on the shelf. They stayed. And as the candle flickered once, not because of wind, but because it needed to, you realized you hadn't been hosting these meals. You'd been answering them. You had just finished arranging the chairs, not because you knew who was coming, but because leaving them scattered felt dangerous. The kind of dangerous that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but with quiet misalignment, like spoons placed handle up or a loaf cut into odd numbers. So you adjusted. 4 chairs, one for you, one for the goose, one for someone who might be late, and one for someone who might not need a chair at all. It was almost evening, and the light filtering through the window was that thin, watery gold that makes everything look like it's already faded. You had nothing cooking, no invitation in hand, no visitor at the door, but the candle lit itself. That was your first sign. You didn't react. By now, you've learned that reacting gives whatever's about to happen too much permission. So, you merely nodded and checked the shelf. The usual suspects were there: fork, mirror, onion skin, salt, bread crumb, lentil, the broom, the scroll dust, even the floorboard, which had recently been represented by a sliver of splinter, in an otherwise empty jar. But something had shifted. The tablet, it now held a name. A new one. Only a name. No mark, no title, no trace of who or what it belonged to. You said it aloud, carefully, slowly, like biting into fruit you didn't trust. The walls sighed. You felt it, rather than heard it the way old fabric exhales when you unfold it after many years, releasing a smell that reminds you of something, but won't quite say what. You looked around. No guest appeared. The table remained still. The goose was absent. That was unusual. And then, not a gust of wind, not a flicker of shadow, but a presence. A weight in the room. Not heavy, not oppressive, just unmistakable. You didn't see anyone, but one of the chairs creaked. Not dramatically. Not like a warning. More like a tired acceptance. Like something had finally sat down after being expected too long. You poured wine into that cup. Because you couldn't not. The name on the tablet pulsed once, not with light, but with acknowledgement. You couldn't explain it. You just knew it had been received and, apparently, accepted. You served food. The lentils had returned, uninvited but welcome, bubbling faintly in the pot, despite no fire underneath it. You plated 3 portions. Your own, the goose's, and the one for the name. You did not expect the food to be touched. You were wrong. When you returned from the cupboard, one blink, one half step, a bite was missing. Not gone, not hidden, just no longer there. The spoon remained clean. You did not ask questions. You didn't look at the tablet again that night. You already knew what it would say. Instead, after the meal, you placed the empty plate on the shelf. It did not wobble. And when the goose finally arrived long after the candle had burned halfway down, it only looked at the plate, then at you, and for the first time in many dinners, it blinked, slowly, once, then sat down and said nothing. You hadn't intended to speak to it. The tablet, that is. It had always been something you read, never something you dared to address directly. It was a fixture, a narrator with clay skin and no voice, a ledger of presence. You consulted it, maybe glanced at it with mild fear or casual reverence, but you never thought of it as something that responded. It wasn't a guest. It wasn't even a participant. It was background, solid, passive, until it wasn't. You had risen early before the light shifted into its usual thin and theatrical glow. The floor felt colder than usual. Your breath in the air had shaped a puff of punctuation at the beginning of a sentence no one had yet written. You lit the fire. Slowly. It caught on the third try, which meant it was going to be that kind of day. You made tea, or the medieval approximation of it. Steeped herbs that smelled vaguely like old libraries, and the kind of apology you give when you don't really mean it. The cup warmed your hands, but not your mood. Not yet. The tablet sat on the shelf. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It didn't whisper. It just waited. You don't remember speaking. You remember the silence. The tension in your chest. The tea halfway to your mouth. And then your own voice. Low. Dry. Almost a cough. You asked, without thinking, "What am I supposed to do?" That was all. A question spoken to no one, or perhaps to everything at once. And immediately not with drama, not with spectacle. The tablet table. The top layer of clay dried instantly, cracked in the middle. The letters that formed weren't carved or impressed, they rose, gently, like bread baking in reverse. You read it. You didn't want to, but you did. You are already doing it. No punctuation. No embellishment. The tablet went still again. You set your tea down too fast. Some spilled. It formed a pattern on the table, unintentionally symmetrical, the kind of shape monks might have stared at until their knees ached. The room did not change. Nothing flashed. The goose didn't appear. The candle remained lit. And yet, you felt something enormous had just occurred. Like you'd finally opened a door you had been walking past every day, assuming it was just painted onto the wall. You didn't move for a long while. Eventually you stood, not because you had somewhere to go, but because sitting any longer might make the thought too real. You walked to the shelf, reached for the tablet. It was cool, solid, quiet. You turned it over. No symbols, but faintly, barely there, your own handwriting. You hadn't written on it. And yet, there it was. This is the middle of the story. You placed it back. You didn't add anything to the shelf. Not this time. Instead, you stepped back, looked at everything you'd collected. The mirror, the feather, the fork, the bread, the broom, the tablet, the floorboard, the chair, the plate, the name. And somewhere between them all, something watched. You didn't mind. The first sign was the bowl. It wasn't your bowl. You knew that immediately. The shape was wrong, slightly too round, with a lip that curled in on itself, like it was trying not to share. The glaze shimmered in a way that suggested it remembered being something else entirely. And yet, there it was, on your table, at the center, like it had always been part of your crockery collection, and you were simply the one who hadn't noticed. You stared at it. Then, very slowly, you touched it. Warm. Not warm like a bowl left in the sun. Warm like a sigh. Or a memory that's been kept under the bed too long and is now waking up, hungry. You didn't recall placing it there. You also didn't recall making extra food, but the bowl was full something grainy, golden, sweet-smelling but unfamiliar. It shimmered faintly. Not glowing, not magical, just noticed. The kind of food that wants to be looked at but not eaten. You stepped back, just slightly. The door creaked. Not open, just a creak, as if someone had leaned on it from the other side, trying to decide whether they were ready to be seen. You braced yourself. The Goose. No. A man entered. Sort of. At first glance he looked like a traveller. Muddy boots. Cloak slightly askew. Hair tangled in the charming, accidental way. That never actually happens by accident. He smiled with too many teeth. Not more than he should have, but more than made sense. You asked nothing. He said everything. Nice bowl, he said, strolling in like the house belonged to his memory. You nodded. He circled the table once. Looked at the candle, the salt, the shelf. His gaze paused at the mirror shard. He nodded, as if recognizing an old acquaintance. Then he sat, not in a guest's seat, in the Goose's seat. You blinked. The Goose had not yet arrived. That should have been your first warning. But you didn't say anything. You served no food. He didn't wait to be served. He reached for the bowl and dipped his fingers in like someone sampling a memory. He tasted it. He closed his eyes, smiled, sighed, then opened one eye and said, "You didn't know this was a feast, did you?" You shook your head. You were still holding your breath. He grinned again. It always is, when we show up. And that's when the air changed. Not colder, not heavier, just aware. The walls leaned in. The window stopped pretending to be a window. The candle flame went perfectly still. And then the Goose arrived. It didn't onk. It didn't sit. It stood. At the threshold, watching. The man raised his hand, not in greeting and acknowledgement. "I was early," he said, as if that explained the trespass. The Goose did not respond. But neither did it leave. You stood still as a table leg. Eventually the man stood, wiped his fingers on the air, yes, the air, and said, "Next time make soup." He walked out. The bowl was empty. You didn't remember blinking. The food was gone. The bowl was gone. The seat was empty. But the taste, something like honey and old music, lingered in your mouth long after. You were almost fooled. It was late afternoon, that soft hour when the sun pretends to be gentle and every shadow feels like it's waiting for something to start. You had just begun the entirely unceremonious task of washing the same bowl 3 times, not out of cleanliness, but superstition, when you heard the knock. This time, it wasn't hesitant. It was cheerful, confident. The kind of knock that announces I brought something before you've even opened the door. So you did. And there she was. A woman, or someone playing one extremely well. She had a woven basket filled with cheeses that looked real enough to sweat. Her dress was peasant simple, patched in the right places, dyed in the wrong ones. A smudge of something earthy adorned one cheek. Her hair was messy, in the way only people who've never had to be truly messy can manage. You blinked. She smiled. "I heard you've been hosting," she said, in a tone that walked the line, between flirtation and accusation. You stepped aside. She entered without waiting. The Goose was not there yet. You noticed that immediately. There was something unnerving about its absence now, like missing a heartbeat and waiting for the next one to arrive. She placed the cheese on the table with a bit too much ceremony. Not a thunker placement. Reverent. As if cheese, under the right circumstances, could be divine. You didn't ask her name. You wanted to. But something in the way she held her smile, too steady, too polished, too timeless, told you that names were beside the point. "I brought the good kind," she said, unwrapping one wheel that oozed slightly from the side. The smell hit you like memory, sharp, salty, and too familiar to place. You nodded. She began slicing. Each cut was exact, mechanical, like she wasn't slicing cheese at all, but separating moments in time. You set out plates, though you hadn't meant to. You poured wine, though you hadn't intended to open any. Your hands moved without you. Your mouth stayed closed. Then, as she laid the final slice on the final plate, she looked at you and said, "You've done well." You don't know why that made your throat close up. Maybe because no one had said it in so long. Maybe because it didn't sound like praise. It sounded like evaluation. She sat. but not at the table. On the floor. Cross-legged, calm, completely in control of a room she'd only entered 5 minutes ago. The candle beside the cheese sputtered once, then steadied. You sat too. Neither of you ate. You stared at the cheese. It stared back. Then the door creaked. The goose arrived. It did not look at the cheese. It looked at her. She nodded. It walked to the shelf. Stared at the mirror shard. Stared at the tablet. Stared at you. Then sat, finally, beside her. Neither of them touched the food. You did. You picked up a slice. It melted slightly between your fingers. You tasted it, and immediately remembered a house you've never lived in, and a song you've never heard, and a promise you once made in a dream. You did not take a second slice. The basket was empty. She was gone. You hadn't blinked. The room smelled faintly of almonds and inevitability. By now, you've grown used to small oddities. Forks that hum. Fireplaces that flicker at the mention of certain names. Bread that arrives on its own schedule. These things, while inconvenient, have become predictable in their unpredictability. You've learned to accept them with the same resigned calm you might reserve for chronic rain or a neighbour who plays the lute. At unreasonable hours. But today it wasn't a small thing. Today the house changed. Not all at once, not with the collapse of walls or the sudden appearance of new doors. No, it was quieter than that, more deliberate. You noticed it first when you walked into the kitchen and found the pot already boiling, though you hadn't lit the fire. Then the table longer than you remembered, with chairs you didn't own. 8 of them, all slightly mismatched, all slightly expectant. You hadn't planned anything. Not today, but the house had. The windows were open, despite the wind, and a soft, slow smell had taken over the room, something between honey and rosemary, and whatever memory lives. In the corners of an old wool blanket, the floor creaked gently under your feet, but not in protest, more like a murmur of acknowledgement. You moved through the house slowly. The goose was nowhere to be seen. You lit a candle. It blew out on its own. You lit another. This one stayed. Then, as you stepped toward the hearth, you saw it. The table fully set. Utensils perfectly aligned. Bread sliced with mathematical certainty. Cups filled to just below the rim. Someone had arranged this with care. Someone had known exactly how many guests were coming. Except you. You stood still, listened, and that's when you heard it, the sound of conversation. Muffled, layered, not from outside, not from upstairs, from within the house, somewhere in the bones of it. Voices rising and falling like wind through parchment. You couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, polite, formal, ancient. You took a step toward the table. The seat at the head was pulled out. You didn't pull it out. You hadn't touched any of this. You sat, not because you wanted to, but because something in the room made it impossible not to. Like the floor would have refused to support you otherwise. And then, one by one, they arrived. Not through the door. Not through the walls. They arrived in awareness. Each guest a presence more than a body, though some had shapes. Some were only outlines. Some were smells or ideas, or the sudden heaviness of the chair beside you. No one spoke. Not aloud. But every thought you had felt heard. Every motion you made felt watched, but not in the way that judges, in the way that records. The table accepted it all. Food appeared. Not dramatically. Not with sparkles or flash. Just there. A fig. A folded leaf with something soft inside. A cup of water that somehow carried a scent. You ate without chewing. You drank without swallowing. You remembered things that hadn't happened yet. When the meal ended, the guests vanished. Not left. Vanished. You remained seated. You had not hosted. You had not served. You had not been served. You had simply attended. And the house, finally still, seemed satisfied. You don't remember inviting them. But then again, you don't remember inviting anyone anymore. The door has become more suggestion than barrier, the walls a formality, and the table a magnet for people who treat time like something optional. Still, when you saw him tall, narrow-faced, with the kind of smile that folds itself into your thoughts. Like it's always been there, you knew something was different. He wore a mask. Not the theatrical kind. Not painted. Not carved. Just wrong. Skin-coloured, but too smooth. Eyes visible, but too distant. His voice didn't come from behind the mask. It came from the side of it. As though he had placed it slightly off-centre on purpose, to disorient anyone trying to listen too closely. He said his name was nobody. You said nothing. He sat before being offered a seat. He poured wine from a bottle you didn't own into a cup you didn't recognise. The wine was clear. Not water too heavy, too fragrant but transparent in a way. That suggested it might not want to be seen. He drank it without blinking, without swallowing. The glass remained full. The goose was already there, silent, still. It watched him with interest, not suspicion, not fear, but something closer to recognition, as if it had once worn the same mask. Nobody spoke again. Do you remember when this was your house? You didn't answer, because you did, and you didn't. He laughed, softly, the kind of laugh that sticks in the air, like a loose thread you're afraid to pull. This place remembers, he continued, gesturing vaguely at the ceiling, the chair, the floorboard. Even if you don't. He placed something on the table. A coin. Not gold. Not silver. Not metal. Clay. Perfectly round, smooth on one side, impressed on the other with a spiral so precise. It hurt your eyes. You picked it up. It was warm. Of course it was. He didn't eat. You offered bread the plain kind, out of habit, but he waved it away. Said he'd already eaten. Said he was full of memory and time. Said it the way someone might say they're full of lentils. Then, suddenly he asked a question. Do you want it back? You didn't know what he meant. Your name? Your house? Your silence? He smiled again, wider. The mask didn't move. You never lost it, he said. You just lent it to the story. And then, like steam leaving a cup, he was gone. Not disappeared, just gone. The windglass remained. The chair remained. The coin remained. You placed the coin on the shelf. It rolled once, then stopped perfectly in place like it had rehearsed. The tablet did not change. But the candle burned twice as slow for the rest of the evening. Later, when you went to bed, you found a second pillow beside your own. You didn't touch it. You didn't remove it. You just lay down, turned your back to it, and pretended not to wonder. The meal hadn't started yet. At least not by your reckoning. The candles had only just been lit, still burning tall and unused. The bread was still cooling on the windowsill, not yet touched by butter or fingers or the inevitable consequences of sharing. The broth was still humming softly on the hearth, not boiling, not simmering, just murmuring its intentions like an old friend rehearsing a story. It's told too many times, and yet there it was, a plate, on the table, not one of yours. Not chipped on the edge, not stained by wine that remembered too much, not familiar in its slight wobble. This one was smooth, round, a greyish ceramic with the faint sheen of age pressed into modernity. Centred perfectly at the far end of the table. No chair beside it, no cup, no utensils, just the plate. And it was empty, but not clean. There were traces, crumbs, a smear of something red. Not blood, nothing so dramatic. Something more, fruit-like, but less friendly. A pomegranate, maybe, or the suggestion of one, if it had been reimagined by someone who'd never tasted anything but memory. You stared at it longer than you should have. Something about the way it already looked post-meal unsettled you. As though the act of dining had occurred without you, and you'd missed not only the food, but the story that went with it. The goose entered silently. It walked past the table. Didn't look at you. Didn't look at the plate. Went straight to the shelf, as it often does now, as if checking attendance. You opened your mouth to ask what, you're not sure, but something in the air told you not to speak. Not yet. Then came the guest. They didn't enter from the door. They didn't emerge from the wall. They were simply present, seated at the table across from the plate, though there was no chair beneath them. Not visibly, anyway. They were cloaked in shadow, but not the kind caused by the absence of light, more like the presence of too many pasts. layered one over the other, like a palimpsest soul that no longer bothers to be legible. You didn't see their face, but they raised a hand, thin, long fingers. Fingernails stained dark, not from filth, but from time. They tapped the edge of the plate once, not impatiently, not expectantly, just as if to confirm it was real. You said, softly, "There's more if you're hungry." They shook their head, not a no, more a sideways motion of tired inevitability. "This was all I needed," they said. Their voice was dry, like old paper or the inside of a library that never opened its windows. You nodded. You didn't argue. The figure stood, not a rise exactly, just a retraction, like something that had borrowed shape for a moment and was now returning it to the shelf. You blinked. They were gone. The plate remained, still empty, still not clean. You picked it up. It was warm. You placed it gently on the shelf, beside the coin, beside the salt, beside the mirror. And when you turned back to the table, you saw something new, your own plate. Already filled. Already waiting. And suddenly you weren't sure if the guest had eaten at all, or if you had. It started with the clinking. Not sharp, not metallic, not even particularly rhythmic, just the gentle knock of ceramic against ceramic, faint and deliberate. Like the beginning of a lullaby composed entirely of dishware. You weren't pouring anything. You weren't holding a cup. You were sweeping. Quietly. Without purpose. The broom moved as it always did in half moons, and apologies when you heard it. Once. Then again. You turned toward the table. Each cup had moved. Not much. Not dramatically. Just a few inches inward, like they were leaning toward one another, conspiring. The kind of movement that didn't demand attention, but refused to go unnoticed. You stood still. The broom stopped mid-gesture, straw tip hovering just above the ground like it, too, was listening. There were 6 cups, but you'd only set 5, and you hadn't filled any of them. And yet, all 6 were full. Different colours, different textures. One clear, one deep red, one thick and golden, like liquid time. One bubbling faintly, one still and dark, reflecting the ceiling as if it were a pool. The 6th was pale green, and it was in front of your seat. You didn't sit, not yet. One by one, the guests arrived, quietly. Not with footsteps, you're not sure they had feet, but with presence. The air shifted slightly around each arrival, like someone rearranging cushions in your memory. A scent would change, a floorboard would sigh, a candle would lean. You never saw anyone walk in, but they were there. All 5 seats were taken. The 6th remained yours. You moved toward it slowly, your feet softer than usual, as if not to disturb the drinks. The goose was already present, sitting beside the shelf, eyes half-lidded, as though observing a ritual it seemed performed long before cups were invented. You sat. No one spoke. No one chewed. No plates, no cutlery. Only the cups. You reached for yours. It was cool to the touch, but not cold. The green liquid didn't slosh, it held still, as if waiting for the right moment to be real. You raised it. So did the others. Not quite in unison, more like agreement. No words were exchanged. No prayers, no speeches, no demands for good health or better harvests. Just the raising of cups. To what? You didn't ask. You didn't want to know. You drank. The taste was mild, like water that had studied herbs but never committed to any. There was a faint note of mint, or perhaps envy, or perhaps the feeling you get when you almost remember something but the shape of it slips through your teeth. Across the table, the other guests drank too. Some sipped, some let it linger. One poured theirs onto the floor, where it was silently absorbed. When it was done, all cups were empty, except yours. Yours had refilled itself. Just slightly. You didn't drink again. You stood, collected the cups. One by one, you placed them on the shelf. They fit. Exactly. You didn't count them. You didn't need to. And when you returned to your seat, the table was gone. But the ritual wasn't. It never ends. It only pauses between toasts. It was late. later than usual. The kind of late that leans on your shoulders and turns every candle into a sigh. You were cleaning not because anything was dirty, but because doing nothing felt louder than the creak of the beams above your head. The table had been cleared, the guests unmanifested, the goose long gone. Everything was as it should be, which, in this house, meant something was about to happen. You opened the cupboard. It wasn't a dramatic motion. You simply reached, pulled, looked. The plate was gone. Not one from the shelf. Not one of the ceremonial ones, not the cracked one with the ivy glaze or the pewter one that sweats when lies are told nearby. Just a regular, familiar dish. It had held cheese earlier. You'd meant to finish it. You didn't. You'd meant to wrap it. You didn't. You'd meant to put it away. In the cold pantry, or at least throw a towel over it. You did none of those things. And now it was gone. At first, you blamed yourself. You searched the room, checked the counter, lifted the bread bin, stared into the hearth as if the coals might confess to culinary crimes. Nothing. Then you turned to the shelf. There it was. The plate, not visibly moved, not proudly presented. Just there, as if it had never left. But now it was clean, not washed. Clean, spotless, not even a scent. You touched it. It was warm. You didn't warm it. You placed it back carefully and turned away. You told yourself, perhaps I did wash it after all. You told yourself, perhaps I'm more tired than I thought. You told yourself, perhaps the candlelight is playing tricks again. Then you heard it. A sound so quiet it couldn't have existed, but it did. The distinct, unmistakable scrape of a spoon inside a bowl, the soft ring of ceramic against ceramic, followed by a slow, thoughtful exhale. You didn't move. The sound didn't repeat. You walked to the table. Everything was empty. Everything was still. But when you leaned closer to the corner, the one where guests rarely sat, you noticed something new, a folded napkin. Not yours. Not fabric you owned. And not folded the way you fold things. Inside it, a pit. A peach pit. You hadn't served fruit. You hadn't bought peaches. You hadn't even seen a peach in months. You held it between your fingers. It was damp. It was warm. It smelled faintly of salt, summer, and something older than either. You placed it on the shelf. There was space for it. You didn't make space. It had been waiting. The candle nearest the pit flickered sideways, though there was no breeze. You sat down, not because you were tired, but because the floor felt too observant to keep standing on. You stared at the pit. You whispered, "You're welcome," though no one had said thank you. And for a moment, just a flicker of weight in the air, someone smiled. You didn't see it. You didn't need to. The taste of peach lingered in the back of your mouth anyway. You were alone, or so you believed, which by this point meant very little. In this house, solitude had become something of a decorative illusion, always placed neatly on the mantelpiece, never quite convincing anyone it belonged. You had just finished rearranging the shelf again, not drastically, just nudges, alignments. The coin had tilted during the night. The fork leaned a little too far left. The pit had rolled a few inches down the ledge, as if trying to whisper something, with its stemless body. You weren't expecting a visitor. You weren't expecting a question. And you certainly weren't expecting the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't from the door. It wasn't from outside. It came from the far wall. The one with no windows, no hinges, no excuses. A flat, dull surface. You'd never given much thought to until it rapped 3 times, with a slow confidence that made the air in your throat arrange itself into a question you didn't dare ask. You stood, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to remind your knees they were still responsible for holding you. The wall didn't knock again. You stepped closer. The candles didn't flicker. The goose absent this evening didn't materialize. The tablet on the shelf remained unmoved. And yet you felt watched, not by something peering in, but by something leaning out, from behind the wall. You placed your hand against it, cool, solid, real, and then it gave way. Just a breath, a shiver, the faintest inward pull, like a curtain deciding whether it should billow. Your fingers passed through, not entirely, just enough to know that the wall wasn't only wall. It was suggestion. It was boundary by habit, and it had opened for you. You pulled back. You didn't step through, but the invitation was clear. Instead, you sat down at the table. You didn't pour wine. You didn't light a second candle. You didn't speak, but on the table something new had arrived. A note, not paper, not parchment, not clay. A note made of bark, thin, curled, still smelling faintly of the tree it came from. You unfolded it slowly. The writing was carved, not with a tool but with intention. The grooves were shallow but final. You do not need to open the door. The door remembers how to open you. You blinked. The message didn't change. You folded the bark and placed it on the shelf. It fit between the spoon and the peach pit. You hadn't placed a spoon there, but there it was, bent backward, as if caught mid-recoil from something it tasted. You looked back at the wall. It had returned to stillness. No more knocks. But the silence was shaped like a question now. You left it unanswered. Not because you were afraid, but because some questions are meant to be kept warm for later. You made tea. It steeped faster than usual. You didn't drink it, but the steam curled toward the wall, and the wall just barely breathed it in. You were tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that settles behind the ribs, like a soft stone, whispering reminders that you've been listening too long, hosting too long, watching too many cups empty and too many items find their way to the shelf without your consent. You'd spent the morning pretending to tidy. You rearranged the spoons again. You dusted things that weren't dusty. You straightened the parchment bark, adjusted the mirror shard, moved the floorboard splinter half an inch to the left. Not because it needed to move. Because it seemed like the kind of day where something would move with or without your help, and you'd rather feel like you had a say in it. Then the light changed. Not outside, not from the window. Inside, the room did not brighten. It thickened, as if light had been poured into the corners like syrup. It clung to the shelves, coated the backs of the chairs, settled into the seams between the stones of the hearth. Warm, but not heat. Bright, but not clarity. Familiar in the way your name sometimes feels when someone you haven't seen in years says it too gently. And then the knock came. Just one. No echo. No second attempt. You didn't open the door. You didn't need to. It opened itself. They stepped in. Not walked. Not glided. Stepped deliberately. Like someone entering a memory they weren't sure they still belonged to. They wore white. Not shining. Not holy. Just honest. The colour of unfinished pages. Their face was soft. Not in shape, but in presence, as if you could look at it for hours and still not remember a single detail, except the feeling it left behind. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They looked at the shelf. Their eyes, which you could not describe, paused on each item. A small nod for the feather. A smile brief and private for the peach pit. A slow blink at the spoon. You stood. Offered them a chair. They did not sit. You offered them tea. They declined. You offered silence. They accepted. You both stood. The shadows grew thinner. Time, which had been wobbling around the rim of the room for days, settled into a soft pool near the hearth and finally stopped spinning. They reached into their robe, pulled out something so small you almost missed it. A seed, not of anything you recognized. It was pale, oval, with faint ridges along its sides and a warmth that did not come from hands. They handed it to you. You accepted it without question, the way you accept rain after weeks of too much sun. You placed it on the shelf. A tiny space had already formed for it. You looked back. The guest was gone. Not vanished. Not dissolved. Simply not where you'd left them. The door was still open, but the room was still warm. The seed shimmered, once not glowing, but agreeing. You sat, not because you needed rest. Because some guests leave gifts that keep growing when no one is looking. The table was already set. Not by you, not recently anyway. You hadn't touched it since the guest with the seed. You'd swept around it, out of habit, not purpose. You'd avoided it with your eyes. the way one avoids looking directly at a question they no longer want answered. And yet, here it stood arranged, composed, quiet. 6 places again, each one complete, each cup filled, each plate empty, not clean, just empty, as if waiting to be filled with something that wasn't food. The candlelight had taken on a different colour. Still gold, but worn gold like jewellery inherited from someone whose name you're not allowed to speak. The air didn't feel heavy. It felt prepared, as if the room itself had taken a deep breath and was now holding it, waiting to see whether the evening would rise or collapse. The goose entered first. It walked slowly this time, with none of its usual ghostly confidence. Its steps were measured, almost careful, as though the floor might betray it. It circled the table once, paused near your chair, looked at the shelf. Then, without sound, it sat in a corner, not at the table, not watching you, watching the door. That's when the air shifted again. You felt it in your ears before you felt it in your chest, that strange sensation. Like someone had opened a second world just a crack and let some of it leak in. The taste of distant thunder. The hush that comes before someone tells a truth they didn't mean to share. The guest didn't knock. They simply arrived. Not through a door, not through the wall, not even with light. They were already there, and your eyes caught up later. Their face, if it was a face, shimmered slightly at the edges. Their hands were empty. They carried no basket, no scroll, no offering, no tool. But when they sat at the head of the table, of course the entire room leaned forward. Even the shadows. They said nothing. You offered them nothing. And still, something passed between you. It wasn't a conversation. It was a transaction of knowing. They looked at the shelf, then at you, then at the seed. You nodded. Not because you understood, because you agreed. They raised their cup. The others, silent, sudden, seated, followed. You were the last. You raised yours. Nothing was drunk. No hands moved. The candlelight dimmed, not extinguished, softened. The guests stood, and as they stood you realized no one had eaten. No plates had been touched. No crumbs left behind. And yet the feast had happened. In the quiet, in the breathing, in the seeing. They walked to the shelf, paused, and without taking anything, they placed a single strand of thread, white, thin and curved on the edge. Then they turned and left. Not through the room, through you. The air inside your chest stretched. Something softened behind your eyes. The goose stood, looked at the thread, then at you, then left too, not in fear. In understanding. You placed the thread where it belonged, between the coin and the pit. It didn't move. It never would. So now, the table is quiet again. The shelf is full not of things, but of moments you didn't plan to keep. A feather that once meant a question. A spoon that recoiled from meaning. A peach pit that tasted like someone else's memory. And somewhere, near the centre, a thread so light that even time hesitated to weigh it down. You sit in the stillness, not to end the night, but to acknowledge it. Not everything requires closing. Some evenings fold themselves, gently, like parchment softened by breath. The candle flickers low, not in warning. In rhythm. The air is slower now. The walls lean back. The house, too, seems to exhale. Thank you for being here, for staying, for listening, for pausing long enough to share a room. With gods who forget themselves and mortals who remember too much. If your eyes are still open, that's all right. If they've already closed, the story is still yours. There will be more feasts, more plates, more strange arrivals and familiar silences. And you know it will repeat tomorrow, as it always does.